Welcome to this episode of the Lake Doctor podcast. Joining me is my favorite lake nerd, Dr. Nate Bosch.
Yeah, and we've got kind of a different setup here today.
It is
We're
a lot
actually
different.
in the conference room at the Lilly Center. Our learning lab, where we normally are, is inundated with K-12 students this week for field trips, and so we got kicked out.
Well, you couldn't have pulled some strings and said,
maybe
hey,
we could have,
no,
but
that's okay. That education center is there to help educate kids. And we're
yes.
really excited that you're hosting K through 12 kids this week.
Yeah.
So I don't mind moving.
No.
The Lake Doctor's in. And today we've got it's going to be a lot different, isn't it,
Yeah.
Nate? We don't have one guest.
Right. So we're going to kind of go through some highlights. So our topic is wetlands today, and we've had a number of guests over season 2 talking about wetlands on the podcast. And so we're going to show our viewers and allow our listeners to listen in on certain highlights of each of those guests talking about wetlands. And then you and I are going to provide a little commentary to each of those.
Oh, that's exciting.
Yeah.
So today, or the first one that we're going to do
Yep.
is going to be the one called How to Eat Like a Wetland with Landon Vine. And I
Right.
loved this episode. Landon had some really good examples of wetlands being the filter
Yes.
or like the kidney of
Yes.
a lake system.
Yeah, so I love his description of wetlands as a kidney, and he kind of flips it on its head, and so it'll be really fun for our listeners and viewers to think about what would it be like if you didn't have a kidney, rather than how we often talk about it as what does it do? What does it do when it is there? And then we'll talk a little bit about how wetlands interface with lakes and streams as well, which is why we're talking so much about wetlands on this season of the podcast.
My favorite thing about lakes and streams, wetlands.
All right.
Let's listen to what Landon has to say.
Wetlands not only are valuable kind of in and of themselves for what's living there, but they also provide a value for other ecosystems that are nearby. And so when we think of lakes and streams, wetlands are really important for lakes and streams because oftentimes water will move through a wetland on its way to a lake or a stream, or a lake or a stream might flood its banks, and then that extra water goes into a wetland area. And those wetlands have the opportunity then to filter the water, to make it cleaner, also to absorb some of the extra flood water when we have really intense snowmelt events or rain events. And so wetlands just provide just a whole bunch of really important services.
One of the most striking images that he referenced in that interview was that wetlands are like Mother Nature's kidneys. If that's true, then if a landscape doesn't have wetlands, it's almost like a human body without kidneys. Okay, there's stuff that can cause our organs not to work, and it's our kidneys' job to take care of that so that all the other stuff works the way it's supposed to and can do its job. So that's kind of a good metaphor for what a wetland will do specifically to a lake. Now, they'll do it for the whole landscape, and they'll do it for all sorts of things other than lakes, but specifically for a lake, okay? On the one hand, Nate, like you were saying, when water is moving into a lake, whether it's moving across the landscape or whether it's moving from a creek or river or stream that drains into the lake, okay, it's going to be carrying some kind of pollution with it. Especially, in certain landscapes, especially in Indiana, there might be some kind of pollution or a lot of pollution in the water that goes into your lake. And once it gets into your lake, it's going to hit that slow-moving water, and it just stays there. Now it's the lake's problem.
Right.
Okay. Well, you were saying, Nate, that if that water has to pass through a wetland on the way to the lake, it slows it down. Some of that pollution will fall out of the water and will stay in the wetland instead of going to the lake. And that's not a problem for the wetland because wetlands kind of love pollution. Just like, it's kind of like our kidneys,
Yeah.
So Nate, now we're going to hear from Nathan, Herbert, and you talking about the different types of wetlands.
Yeah, so we've got 4 main types that we'll go through. And it's interesting to think about pH as a difference between a couple of those types.
I know.
Bogs and
Bogs
fens.
have a different pH than a fen.
Right.
And I wonder what a swamp has. Let's listen to what Dr. Nate has to say about those.
Bogs are a specific type of wetland. So we've talked about wetlands. You could have a marsh, which is going to be more herbaceous or green plants, think cattails or those sorts of things. You can have a swamp, which is usually more of a wooded wetland where you have woody species like trees or buttonbush or something like that. You can have a bog, which typically is going to have that sphagnum mat on the top and some plants growing in it, sometimes even trees. Like, isn't there a spruce that can grow, like a black spruce or something?
Tamarack, and there's some spruces that'll go. Red maples will pop up in them, yeah.
Yeah, but that bog is very different in that typically you'll have rainwater, which is slightly acidic, comes to a depression in the landscape. And with that acidity, then you've got the sphagnum, which reinforces the acidity. And so only certain plants and animals probably will live in the bog. We've talked about fens on this podcast as well. That's more where you have groundwater coming out, which is going to have a higher pH. And so that would be a different sort of a wetland than a bog, which is going to have a more acidic pH.
One of the next highlights we're going to talk about, Nate, is the one with Nate Simons, and his episode, I think, was titled Controlled Burns. I love being part of these podcasts because I learned so much. The economic impact of our lakes in Kosciuszko County, $400 million per year is the estimate.
Right.
And that alone is worth investing in keeping our lakes healthy through wetlands. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so what's interesting in this next segment that we're going to watch is we connect the economic value of the lake to the wetlands that the water flows from to get into the lake. And then Nate Simons goes a step further and talks about the upland ecosystem even above the wetland that goes into the wetland, that goes into the lake, that has the big economic value. So it's a really cool segment that brings all of these different things together.
And he talks about the disadvantage of having monocultures around those environments.
Right. Without that diversity, we lose some of the function of the system, which is cleaning up that water before it gets to the lake.
Like good kidneys.
Yes, exactly.
Well, let's listen to what Nate has to say.
So we found that over $300 million comes into just our county each year because of the lakes that we have here in this area. And if adjusted for inflation, it's been a few years ago, it's well over $400 million today. And so when we think about the lakes are worthy to be protected and cared for. Okay, how do we do that? And we think about what is protecting our lakes. Wetlands are one of those systems that helps protect our lakes. So the healthier wetlands we have, the healthier lakes we're going to have, which means the healthier economy we're going to have. So how do those wetlands do that? Well, one, wetlands can help hold back a lot of water. So we know that oftentimes big flooding events can happen in our communities, called property damage, and those floods can be reduced by having healthy, functioning wetlands. Those wetlands can absorb that water, hold on to it, and then let it either recharge groundwater, the aquifers down below, or it can let that water start to leak out more slowly over time than after a big rain event or a big snowmelt event. Those wetlands also can help our economy by holding back nutrients. So wetlands are great filters. They pull in water, and all of those plants in the wetlands are hungry for nutrients and can pull nutrients out so that then the nutrients don't get passed on into a stream and then maybe a lake where those nutrients can cause weeds or algae to grow, which can reduce property values and reduce some of the recreational value on our lakes. So wetlands are really an important part of our local economy.
And they can be groundwater wetlands or storm-driven wetlands.
Right. Yeah. So the interesting thing about that point is that the focus is on the wetlands as doing the work. But if you look up slope from there, if you allow that stormwater to go into the wetlands, and the wetlands is performing its work, its function, right? But it gets degraded by the stormwater. So you start upslope from that, and if you have healthy uplands, that the water is the flow is reduced before it even gets into the wetlands. Then the wetlands themselves can function better as the filter. They don't get clogged, right, as much.
Yes.
And they also they're a better habitat. Many times, the wetlands that are receiving storm water are filled with these nutrients to which you refer in the sediment, and you end up with a plant community that is a monoculture. It's just nothing but cattails or reed canary grass or Phragmites, common reed. So it starts even higher up than wetlands. And we put, the idea is we got to save these wetlands because they actually have services that help us out. But in reality, we got to take care of it even higher up than that.
And because of that history, some of those wetlands that we have maybe aren't functioning like they once did.
Correct.
And so there's even importance of being able to manage and restore, revitalize some of these wetlands to perform those functions. But if we didn't do anything with the upland, we're just going to be right back to the same problems we have now with the wetlands. So both need to be worked on simultaneously.
So restoring fens, restoring prairies,
oak
restoring
woodlands.
oak woodlands.
Yes.
Nate, we're talking about wetlands. How is a wetlands restored or constructed?
Yeah, well, that's two different things. So a restoration of a wetland could be taking a wetland that's already there and it has been saturated with excess sediments and nutrients over the years. Maybe the upland areas have leaked a lot of sediments and nutrients so that the wetland is overwhelmed and it's no longer holding on to those sediments and nutrients. It's just passing them right along to a stream or a lake downslope. So we could rehabilitate or restore, revitalize a wetland, which could be changing the plants, maybe moving the hydrology, kind of how the water flows through the wetland, so that the wetland again starts to function as a wetland should, where it's absorbing those nutrients and sediments rather than just passing them through. Constructing a wetland is starting with kind of a blank canvas, right? Maybe it's an agricultural field or it's a brown field that was used for industry or something, and it's now being built, it's being optimized as a wetland, and that's often where you can get the highest amounts of nutrients and sediments being reduced as the water goes through that wetland. Usually what you'll do is you'll start with moving the dirt around with excavation. You'll have some sort of a settling pond initially, so the water comes from the stream, starts to settle out sediment, and then there'll be some sort of a stream channel that's vegetated with lots of great wetland plant species. And then there'll be a spot where the water then goes back into that original stream again, cleaner than when it had entered the top of the wetland. And the reason you have that settling pond at the beginning is you get sediment, you get nutrients falling out, and then that's your maintenance location. So in the future, maybe a couple years down the road, you can scoop out some of that excess sediment that has started to fill up that sediment settling area, but the rest of the wetland is still functioning just fine. And so as you go along, you're making sure that that wetland is retaining optimal amounts of sediments and nutrients.
And we had some examples of things that are happening like that.
Yeah, Grand Lake St. Mary's in Ohio, that's their largest inland lake in Ohio. And several of our Lily Center team members went over there to visit Steve and Jacquemin and learn about what they're doing to improve Grand Lake St. Mary's. And we have them as one of our podcast guests.
That was a most interesting podcast.
Yes, they are doing some really effective work there in Ohio, and we're borrowing the expertise that they've learned here in Indiana now.
Super. Let's listen to what Stephen had to say.
We've been very fortunate as a community and as a watershed to be able to restore a lot of that natural habitat. And so I mentioned by the late 90s, the number of wetlands had gone down to 0.25% of the watershed. Very proud to say that today that number is around 2.5+% and climbing and growing. And these are intentional conservation efforts to restore natural habitats. Wetlands are, a great long-term sustainable solution for improving water quality, one aspect of which happens to be nutrient loading that can fuel harmful algal blooms.
Yeah, and you had said as well, stated a little different way when we were there visiting, you were talking about how I thought maybe it was 20% of all of the water that goes into Grand Lake St. Mary's now passes through a wetland, or has the opportunity to pass through a wetland. Maybe it was 10% and you're going towards 20. I don't remember exactly the percentages.
Yeah.
But that was another percentage that I thought was quite important.
No, it is, and you're close there. The goal is to be able to filter all of the water that goes into Grand Lake St. Mary's. That's one of the sort of watershed conservation goals. And in order to filter water out of nature, you need, nature's water filters. You need wetlands to do that. We're up to about 2.5% wetlands, and the goal is not to get back to pre-colonial 1700s estimates. That's not the goal. That's not a realistic goal. The goal would be to get somewhere in the ballpark of around 7 to 10%, probably closer to 7% of the watershed as a wetland. So we are making measurable progress towards that. And the streams that do have wetlands in Grand Lake St. Mary's, of which there's a whole bunch of them, many of these wetlands are able to process close to 15% of every gallon in that stream, or the equivalent of every gallon in that stream. Being able to process this much water has been an incredible thing to see, just because of what they're capable of doing. And that's kind of where the science and the monitoring comes in. And we've been fortunate to be able to keep an eye on these systems and be able to document not just how much water goes through these wetlands on its way to the lake, but what the wetlands are actually doing as they function towards nutrient mitigation.
Nate, you mentioned using plants in a restoration of a wetland.
Right.
How does that work?
Yeah, so these plants are going to be sort of the workhorse of the wetland. The plants are actively growing, so they're doing photosynthesis, they're pulling in the sun's energy, but they're also needing to pull nutrients into their roots to grow the structures of the plants.
And they have very long roots, don't they?
And our native wetland plants have very long roots, so they're pulling from a large area. And what is it that we don't want in our lakes? I'm asking you, Susie.
Oh, my golly. Well, we don't want nutrients that grow.
Right. The algae and excess weeds and those sort of things. So if we can have wetland plants absorbing nutrients as water's flowing through our wetlands, then we keep those nutrients out of our lakes, and we keep our lakes cleaner and healthier than for the future. So in this next segment, we're going to be seeing Jacob Macke, and he's going to be talking about a really cool project that he and his wife are doing on their own personal property. And he's in this clip, he's going to talk about when he first realized the initial plans might be changing a little bit for their area that they're restoring.
I say it about every one of them, but that really was one of my favorite episodes. And that you go into something with an idea of how it's supposed to be, and then you learn, and you've got to shift gears. And Jacob is doing that wonderfully well.
Yes, and science, that's what we always do. We follow the science and find the most efficient solutions for the problems that we find.
Background is mechanical engineering. I didn't know, I've heard wetlands, and I've heard, restoring wetlands is good, but I was looking at a cornfield. And so I thought, okay, that'll probably be a good prairie, it's dirt, cover it with plants, sure. But what I didn't know, and people started telling me as I started looking to what resources are out there, and I'm talking to soil and water conservation and the NRCS and different groups, and they're like, well, you may have the soils you need for wetlands. Well, I don't know what soil types there are. Do you know what soil types, I forget the names of them, but
Houghton muck would be a common one that we'd have in our area, which is usually under a lot of our wetlands.
But they've surveyed the soil types,
Mhm.
and that's in the records they have available. And they looked and they said, yeah, you have 4 or 5 acres worth of wetlands qualified soils. And so you might want to look at doing a wetlands restoration.
That's
And
exciting.
it was very exciting because that brings a whole nother set of plants. It's not just these drier prairie species. Now you need all the wetland species and a lot of wildlife that you could bring in with that. And I think I'm equally excited about the potential of the wildlife coming in.
Nate, Lilly Center is working on lakes and streams. So why are we focusing on wetlands?
Well, as you probably recall from a number of the episodes that we have heard, wetlands are connected with lakes and streams. And so if we want to understand our lakes and streams better and make them cleaner and healthier and safer and more beautiful, which is our mission at the Lilly Center for Lakes and Streams, we need to think about where's that water coming from and what does that water connect to as it's going through our streams and our lakes. And wetlands are a big part of that. Wetlands are kind of that transition zone between the upland terrestrial ecosystems and the lowland aquatic ecosystems. And so we need to understand that transitional ecosystem if we want to understand our lakes and streams. And if we want to make our lakes and streams better, which is the focus of Lake RX, we need to make our wetlands better. So that's why we're talking a lot about wetlands.
And that's a good thing.
It is a good thing. And the added benefit of wetlands is they're beautiful places, aesthetically pleasing places where you can go for a walk or you can sit and just ponder for a little bit. And we've lost so many of those wetland areas in the state of Indiana and across the United States and really across the world, that taking care of those remaining wetland areas or even creating new wetland areas is really important for the future.
So restoration
and revitalization.
Yeah. And creation.
Yes.
And a good place to go watch birds.
Yes. You would know that.
And everyone lives on a watershed. So whatever you do on your property is going to affect water downstream somewhere.
Right.
So let's give a listen to the next clip.
How best can we revitalize those wetlands? Is it as simple as changing the plant communities in those wetlands so that they're more efficient at pulling out those sediments and pulling out those nutrients?
And not a monoculture.
Of one plant.
Using native species that have deep roots.
Yes, native species rather than some of the invasive exotic species. Right. Or it might be a little more complicated. Maybe we need to sort of change the hydrology, change how the water is moving around that wetland. Maybe we have a wetland here that has a stream going just adjacent to the edge of the wetland, but most of that water is not interacting with the entire wetland. Can we actually change where the stream goes so that it starts to meander through the wetland? So the wetland plants have an opportunity to start pulling out those nutrients and sediments from that. We also want to look at constructing brand new wetlands. So we've lost a lot of our wetlands.
That's exciting.
Yeah. And so let's not only potentially make the few we still have left do better work, but what about starting to add back to the number of wetlands in the wetland area that we have? And so our Lilly Center team went out to Grand Lake St. Mary's recently and met with their head researcher there, Stephen Jacquemin. And Dr. Jacquemin was showing us how wetlands have been used there around that lake to pull a lot of nutrients. And what they've done in many locations is they've constructed new wetlands. So they have chosen a piece of property that's not currently in as a wetland, right adjacent to a stream that's flowing into the lake. And we know Grand Lake St. Mary's has had lots of algae toxin issues over the years, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And so they will divert water then into that wetland. And that wetland then is specifically designed to pull out as much nutrient and sediment as possible out of that water. And so there's specific plants planted, there's a specific way that the water moves through that wetland. And then the water coming out of the wetland is measured just as the water going into the wetland is measured. And they actually will change the flow rate going through that wetland to optimize the most sediment and the most nutrient to come out of that water as it's filtering through that wetland. And so we can learn a lot from them and what they're doing and what their research is showing, and implement some of that knowledge and application here around our own lakes.
So, Nate, this has been a little bit different episode for Lake Doctor. Tell us what we learned.
Yeah, so we started with talking about why wetlands are important. We talked about different types of wetlands and the sort of plants and critters that you might see in those wetlands. We talked about economic impact of wetlands. We talked about how the upland ecosystems around wetlands influence the wetlands, which influence the lakes, which influence that economic value. We talked about working with friends in Ohio to learn from some of the interesting wetland work they've been doing around Grand Lake St. Mary's and how that's influencing our current work here in Indiana. We've talked about wetland restoration, good examples of that here locally, and how we hope to do more of that here locally as well going forward.
So speaking of doing more and going forward, tell us what the next step is.
Yeah, so the Lilly Center for Lakes and Streams has been known for doing great research and education over the last 15 plus years, closing in on about 20 years. And so as we have identified challenges in our lakes and streams, have found what the most strategic solutions to those challenges are, we want to be more and more about actually putting those solutions into practice, implementing those solutions. And so we're calling it Lake RX. We're developing custom prescriptions for our local lakes that involve categories of solutions. So we have solutions on the land, which we've talked about in some of these highlighted segments here. We talk about solutions in the water itself. And then also solutions in the community of users around those lakes. And so as we develop these prescriptions and we work alongside our partners to implement these solutions, we will then see our lakes get healthier quicker because of that coordinated effort under this Lake RX program. And in an upcoming episode, we're going to share some really big news about a big step forward in the Lake RX program here at the Lilly Center.
You've sworn me to secrecy, but it is really big news.
Well, don't give it away.
I won't give it away.
People need to wait a few more episodes for that big announcement. What people can do right now, though, one of the things they can do right now is if they're interested in this and they want to look back at one of those full episodes that we showed a clip or they listened to a clip of, in the description of this current episode that we're doing right now, there's links to all of those individual episodes that we referenced here in the current episode.
Or they could just go back and listen to all of them because they're pretty all darn good.
They are pretty good, yeah.
So if you enjoyed this episode, please share it.
Right.
And share it again. And if you'd like to visit our website, it's lakes.grace.edu. Please subscribe. That way you won't miss the upcoming episode with the really, really big news. Join us next time. The doctor is in.